Okay. Okay. Right. You're ready to go now. Ben, thank you, Ben, for coming along and to give your presentation on training and support to commercial hovercraft operations. So over to you to give your presentation.
No, thank you very much. Well, very nice to see everybody this afternoon. Thank you for joining. As Alan said, this is the opportunity to just talk a little bit about the hovercraft training that we provide to different customers and operators around the world. A fairly open discussion, so anytime you want to ask questions, just go ahead. That's no problem. So it's quite interesting when you start looking back at the very early days of operating hovercraft and the history. We came across this this press release which came from Western back in 1962. In fact, it was released on the 13th of December 1962, so which is tomorrow, so almost to the anniversary. It's quite fascinating when you look at the early days of hovercraft training. They were very proud to boast the fact that only 2.5 hours on average was needed for the first non-Western drivers to be able to get to grips with the SRN2. Quite an interesting line in this press release also says the craft's basic stability is evident from the fact that drivers have changed over quite safely with the craft doing 50 knots. It says, looking at how hovercraft training started off in the early days to how it is done now is really quite interesting. Not necessarily the best way to do it. One of the earliest hovercraft accidents was training the Duke of Edinburgh, the Royal Dent in the SRM1, where he drove into a tree stump on a beach. Is still on the craft. Again, quite interesting. But hovercraft training has moved on quite a bit since those early days. Some of the stories we've heard from ex-Hoverloid and Sea Speed captains as well about taking up an SRN4 across the channel after being given an hour's conversion from the SRN6. All credit to them. It must have been quite an achievement to do it. But there's certain reasons why we do a structured training program now. So the training standards for hovercraft. So in the early days, because there was not so much structured training, there were several notable incidents of craft rolling over, crashes, including unfortunately one fatal incident, which was the Hovertravel overturning. Obviously, since then we've learned so much more about what hovercraft are capable of doing, and it has resulted in new legislation. So the Hovercraft General Order was updated, and it produced quite a lot of useful feedback. One of the things we still refer to even now, we've got the stability and control for hovercraft notes for commanders, which goes into a lot of detail about yaw angles, safety parameters, to make sure that we keep hovercraft safe and so that we can set up a proper training program. So with having these training programs in place, serious incidents have rapidly declined as long as craft are operated within the limits taught, and as long as people are willing to have those to undertake those training programs. Civil aviation rules governed hovercraft operations certainly in the UK up until, I'm pretty sure it was around until the year 2000, and then the High Speed Craft Code and the MCA then came in after that and took over hovercraft safety standards. The evidence for being able to continue to encourage people to do training is borne out by two other fairly recent serious incidents where operators have decided not to use proper training techniques and have gone on to do their own driving with a lack of understanding about how a hovercraft is different to operating a conventional marine vessel or any other vessel. A fairly serious incident in South Korea with a very large hovercraft about 10 years ago resulted in quite a bad crash. And also, as people are widely aware of, the first Oita hovercraft had quite a serious incident when it was delivered only a year ago. And again, that was down to a lack of training and a lack of understanding from the operator about why a hovercraft needs a specialist training program, despite a lot of hard work put in prior to the craft arriving to explain it. So where is the guidance for hovercraft training? So the guidance comes from, these days, comes from SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea, an International Maritime Organization convention. Chapter 10 details requirements for high-speed craft. From that, we get the high-speed craft code. And in the UK, we also have the Hovercraft code, which gives some guidance in there as well. Particularly from the high-speed code and the Hovercraft code, it says that you must have some training. It's the same as the Hovercraft Act and Hovercraft General Order says the hovercraft captain must be sufficiently trained. There's a bit more detail in the high-speed craft code, which says that the training course must cover the systems, the safe handling techniques, and the emergency procedures. So that gives us a basic framework to be able to build our training around. It also says that this should be for each craft type. So just because you can drive one type of hovercraft doesn't necessarily mean that you can step into another one and be deemed safe to operate that. So if you've been driving 12,000 TD for Hovertravel, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can jump into a smaller 2,000 TD and operate it safely. You must have some sort of conversion course to be able to be signed off, and then you're issued with a certificate. So training with Griffon. So we've gone back through and we've combined Griffon with Hoverwork and going back into Saunders as well. We reckon there's must be at least over 1,000 students come through the doors over the years, not just with piloting, also with engineering and electrical disciplines as well. The training that we provide can be conducted in the UK and in country where the craft is delivered to as well, and that is with military organisations, commercial and search and rescue organisations all over the world. One of the big changes for us in the past year is that our training programs are now recognised. So, and that means that we have been accredited, and in this case, we've been accredited by the UK Chamber of Shipping. It's quite interesting that, for example, an operator like Hovertravel, they are their training program is audited in effect by the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. Griffon Hoverwork, although we are the for this range of hovercraft, we are the original engineer and manufacturer. We are not necessarily an operator, and under UK legislation, means that we cannot have our training program accredited by the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, because in order to do that, you have to have a set route and you have to have a registered vessel, and you have to, there's certain criteria that we, as a manufacturer, we just can't meet. So being able to get our training recognised and accredited by a well known and respected organisation such as the Chamber of Shipping, who also head up the UK Merchant Navy Training Board, as a really big step for us. And it allows us to go to our customers and other operators and say, we're not just saying that you need this training because we're Griffon, we're saying it's actually a recognised course which covers those three key points from the high-speed craft code, which is the fact that we cover safe handling, the systems, and the emergency procedures, and it's a structured course that we provide. So the route to completing pilot training and certification. So we cover different elements. There's a system theory part of the course, which is based in the classroom. So for pilots, we take them through the basic structure, basic transmission, basic electrical systems, and the basic control systems of the craft. And that's done both in the classroom, and we take them onto the craft as well. So that's the practical side. We take them down, and before we get in the water, we do this, make sure we've covered it off. Basic driving theory, that's explaining how a hovercraft works in theory. So we use our training presentations and slides. We also make reference back to the stability book as well, stability control book. and it's a bit more classroom based, and then that's at the point where we then take the guys out onto the craft and start going through some basic manoeuvring. Once the basic training is completed, then we can move on to more advanced training, so night operation, passenger operation. This might be where you then move into ice operation or search and rescue, and then into emergency situations. So what I thought I'd do, I'll just run through what a typical type racing training course might look like. So I'm just going to stop sharing this screen and take us to another one. Yep. There we go. This is a training course that we've got coming up in the new year. And before we get the students in, we send out the joining instructions. It details what groups they'll be in, where the course is going to be conducted, and what the course is going to cover, and also what requirements there might be for the students that are attending, as well as details on the course layout. So in this case, it's a conversion training course. These guys have already driven a different type of craft previously in the same series. They're converting onto another type of craft, and it's broken into different days. The training is generally, for a basic training course, takes about 25 hours of practical driving and about 20 hours of theory. And we can normally do that in about a week. The first day is mostly in the classroom. And so we'll cover the hovercraft driving theory, 2000, in this case, 2,400 TD systems, and hovercraft history. So it's important, I think, for people to know what they're driving and why it's different to a boat, and to find out where a hovercraft has come from. And then in the afternoon, we'll start them off on initial training on the water, so controls, instruments, the basics of getting a hovercraft moving and stopping. And each day we'll do a debrief and then post-operational checks to get them into that routine of doing the regular tasks. The second day, we'll start to then move into to slightly more advanced techniques. So we'll be doing high-speed turns, understanding yaw and trim. And then we'll, in the afternoon, we'll start to do things like approaching to a navigation mark or coming alongside a pontoon. Again, either side of the day, we'll start with a pre-operational briefing, and at the end of the day, a post-operational debrief. It's a chance to discuss what's gone right, what's gone wrong, and things that we might want to carry on the next day. Third day, then we start to move into landing and departing. So that's, by that time, they've generally got a fairly good feel for the controls, and then we can start to move on to landing, departing, understanding what gradients are doing to the craft as they're maneuvering. Spitway approaches, and so going from a wide beach to a more confined space. And then day 4, we'll do systems recap. Throughout the week, we'll also be doing the pre-operational checks, so getting them into the engine room, getting them down into the skirt system as well. If we lose a finger, we always encourage the students to get in and do the repairs, and not just to rely on the engineers to do it, so that they can fend for themselves a little bit in the field. And then we start moving into emergency drills, so fire drills, rudder failure, pitch failure, man overboard, abandon ship. And then generally by day 4, we'll do a brief introduction to night operations. So it'll be taking them out in the dark and getting them a little bit of a feel for what the craft feels like in hours of darkness or in restricted visibility. And then by day 5, the morning is generally student-led exercises. So anything that they want to cover again from earlier on in the week. And then in the afternoon, there'll be a written exam, which covers the systems theory and some of the driving theory. And then there'll be a practical examination. And then there's generally a presentation at the end of the week, assuming that they've passed. So some of the different training programs that we've conducted just this past year, Hoverdrive in Oita, we're going to come back and talk about that a bit more in a moment. STQ in Canada, they've got a 2000 TD out there, 6 pilots and 5 engineers. Caspian Offshore Construction, they operate a BHT 130 well deck craft. The guys in Canada, they were doing a mixture of conversions and starting from scratch. The guys in the Caspian, they've been driving the craft for quite a while. The type rating certificate under the high-speed craft code guidelines is valid for 2 years. So every 2 years, we do a revalidation for the guys in the Caspian because they don't have their own instructors or examiners at the moment. During COVID, we weren't able to go and visit them physically. And so we were able to conduct an online revalidation, which is something new that we've tried for the first time. And that's where we required them to go and do a series of maneuvers, record them, explain what they were doing during those maneuvers, send the video evidence to us. And then we did an online oral examination style assessment. And that actually proved to be very successful. And it's something that we may explore a bit further with certain operators. Generally for people that are more experienced but don't have their own instructors or examiners. But not so much for new operators. Another training course that we've done this year was with the RNI. So that was an instructor's course. We conducted that here in the UK out of our training centre at Ryde on the Isle of Wight. And then we've also supplied 2 craft to Poland this year. And that was quite a big programme with engineers and pilots being trained up. And that's just completed only about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And again, all of that was done in country in Poland, which was quite useful. Biggest training program we've done this year, Hoverdrive in Oita, 10 pilots, 16 engineers. There's a mixture of that being done in the UK and in Japan. It was definitely more successful in Japan. As we said before, when the operation first started, they were quite determined not to take on training from the UK. And that was because the operation in Japan is slightly unusual in that the people that have bought the hovercraft are not the operator. So the people that own the hovercraft is Oita Prefecture, which is the equivalent of a local county council. They have tendered out the operation to another organisation who had not budgeted for any training. And that caused a few issues because it wasn't included in the original. It was not possible to include it in the original contract because of how the craft was being owned and then leased for operation. And so both the owner and us as the manufacturer at the time were a little bit in a difficult position in how to encourage them to take on training. And unfortunately, it did take the accident with the first craft for them to suddenly realise they needed to undertake a proper training programme, which is what we started in February this year. So the way that the pilot training program works in Japan was that we had quite a narrow window. We had 6 weeks to train 8 pilots, and we had the use of 2 hovercraft, and along with 2 of my colleagues from Hovertravel, we had 3 instructors that we were able to go out and undertake the training program. Quite complicated because only 2 craft. So we had a shift almost with a timetable which allowed one instructor on one craft in the morning with one student, another instructor on the same craft in the afternoon with another student, and then in the second week they would go on to the second craft with the third instructor to complete their hours of training and to finish off the exercises. That allowed us to complete 8 pilots training, each to 25 hours within 6 weeks, and no mean feat, and no, very lucky to have both craft run so reliably during that whole period as well, and have a good weather window considering the time of year. So the way it started off, we were given 16 potential candidates. They all undertook the systems training, so they had a basic idea of how the hovercraft worked. They sat in the classroom, did all the theory over 3 days, and then we took all of them for an aptitude test for about an hour each around the bay, doing some very basic manoeuvres to see who had a good feel for the craft, who had potential, and who was a little bit going to struggle a bit more, which is not easy in a 1 hour session, but combined with their attentiveness over the previous few days as well, did help us to get a good idea about who was going to be a good or better option than others. Then we went into the actual training for each candidate, which was 25 hours of theory training, 25 hours of practical training, followed by written and practical exams, and that got them their basic type rating certificate. And we make it very clear it's not an automatic pass. You do have to show that you can do the tasks that are required, and that's why the person doing the examining is a different person to the person doing the instructing. So there is an independent examiner, usually one of the other instructors, and we swap students around. And we do make it clear as well that the 25 hours is to make these students safe. It's not to make them the world's best hovercraft driver. It's to make them to the point where we are confident that they could get a craft on and off a pad reasonably safely in fair weather conditions. After they've completed that 25 hours, we're then able to do with each of these students, we were able to do a further 15 hours supervised training. So one of my colleagues from Hovertravel, Peter Mulhern, stayed out for another 4 weeks in Japan doing the supervising training, sat alongside each pilot each time they went out, which got them up to 40 hours. And in Japan, at 40 hours, that means that you can legally carry passengers on your ferry. So that's where, for them, 40 hours was quite specific. Regular online training sessions have then been conducted since that time throughout the year. And also we've done a further 2 visits. We did another visit at 80 hours for a couple of weeks, and we did a bit of follow-on training. And again, I've just come back from a visit, and they've now about 140 hours. And if we were putting this in comparison to another operator such as Hovertravel, they do a 25-hour basic training and then 100 hours under supervision, gets them up to about 125 hours before you're allowed to take passengers solo. So, and because of the slightly more complicated nature of the route in Japan, with the S-curve, which is a 600-meter long concrete road the hovercraft has to navigate up, the extra hours allow them to get a bit of more experience to take the craft up there. And even then, we're not just saying, okay, you're good to go, good luck. There's certain weather limitations that we put in place, night training to follow on later. So there's still some more advanced training to do. And it's not just been training confined to pilots. We've also conducted quite a lot of engineering training to make sure the craft is well maintained in accordance with the service schedules. That's involved a group of engineering students with 2 weeks instruction in the UK and 2 weeks intensive instruction in Japan as well, covering structures, transmission, propellers, skirt systems, and all the maintenance that goes with that. The training involved also shadowing on the Hovertravel engineers on a shift for a few days as well. So they're able to see the craft from before the start of service, being able to support the craft through the service, and then seeing the craft at shutdown and the final daily inspections and that side of it as well. And it showing them how to use the paperwork properly, the maintenance logs, and the important communication between engineering and pilot teams. And then we've also had engineering support in country. We've had a different single engineer from Griffon on rotation out in Japan for the first year of the operation as well, to make sure that they're doing everything correctly and are being supported properly during that training. So that particularly that program was quite big. One of the biggest challenges we had in the training for the Japanese is there are very few Japanese that speak fluent English. There's very few that speak fluent technical English, and when you start talking about some of the interesting words we use for hovercraft, that can become quite challenging. We were very reliant on some extremely good interpreters. We had some very mediocre ones as well, and that was a real challenge. But certainly by the end of that trip, and it's interesting when you go to different places in different countries, there are certain keywords that you learn quite quickly. Things like slowly, stop, left, right, or speed up. Just keywords that you can very quickly get across. Are very useful. One of the things which I thought you may or may not have seen already, I thought I'll share as well, is now that we've done all that training for that particular operator, and that operation has now finally come into operation. They've carried their first passengers as of last week, and so we can share a little video about that operation now that it's up and running. Yes. Don't let me share that. I'll try and come back to that in a moment. But if anybody's got any questions while I'm trying to find that, please go ahead.
I just had a comment. You can hear me?
Yes.
Right. I just thought it was interesting that they gave you 16 for you to pick 8. I've never had a client that allowed that, even though it was absolutely necessary many times.
It certainly doesn't always happen. One of the most common things we get is, particularly, I mean, we're very lucky there. That's a commercial operator. Where when we go to military operators, it tends to be a group of people have been selected. They don't really care that they've come to drive a hovercraft. They could be driving a hovercraft or a boat or some sort of a truck for the week, and they've been told you're going to go on a hovercraft course, and you've got to make the best of it. And the thing which is sometimes quite difficult is being very clear at the start. It's not an automatic pass course. You're going to be signed off if you're safe, and if you're not, then you're not going to be signed off. And sometimes that has been quite difficult to get that across.
Once I was presented with 12 people to train in an afternoon.
Right. Yes, yeah, can be a challenge, and so yeah, sometimes it is also managing expectations. Is that you can get the real basic. You can get most people to move a hovercraft around quite quickly, and it's not too difficult to get somebody to get it over hump, go left and right. It takes a bit more time through, and generally we found about 25 hours is about right to get somebody where they're reasonably confident enough to get it on and off a beach or reverse it down a slipway in different circumstances, and to get that across that you need that time. That's sometimes one of the bigger challenges.
Could I ask Ben if about the radar training? I guess that there's standard training for different radars, but do you have a special course for that, or do you rely on other organisations' radar training for being able to interpret radar, not the kind of operational part of using it at night?
So in terms of the actual functions of the radar, we don't provide that specific training because there's so many different options that customers can have.
Right.
So
Okay.
what we're teaching people is how to use a radar when you're on a high-speed craft for collision avoidance or in restricted visibility. And we generally have about a week, depending on the type of operation, it can be between 2 days and a week to do that. So if you're at Hovertravel, you'd do a week of night navigation, and then you would have some weather limitations for different stages of restricted visibility over about 6 months, I think.
Okay, and then for the craft that you supply, you'd require them to have done whatever the appropriate training is for the radar that you supply.
That's
before
right.
they come to do the practical stuff.
That's right. Yeah. So
Okay.
it's generally
Thank you.
speaking, we're quite lucky that tends to get written into most of the contracts. So there's so for the radars being supplied by Simrad or Faruno, it'd be the local agent for that radar come down and explain how to use it, which is because we don't have the time to do that for each individual type.
Yeah. Thank you.
So then when you're charging for these services, do you have a flat rate or how is that worked out? Is it on a case-by-case basis or?
It tends to be, there is a fairly flat rate, and it can be, we work it out for a 25-hour basic training course. And if you break it down per day, then we can sort of, that daily rate, as it were, can be adjusted to whatever the length of the course is, depending on the course type. Sometimes we do adjust it if we're getting a lot of students through. So, for example, the Oita training package, because it was a lot of students in a fairly short space of time, we were able to adjust the price a little bit to make it a bit more attractive without cutting our costs too much. One of the slight challenges for that particular course was we had to effectively contract in 2 extra instructors. Although Hovertravel's a sister company, we still have to pay for any services. So that was a slight additional cost, but we sort of, because of the size of that particular training contract, we were able to soak it up a little bit.
And what happens if you have to supply the hovercraft? How do you cost it when that happens?
So if we supply the hovercraft, which we have done, we factor in a higher charge for the craft. So, and we take into account what we're going to spend on fuel, the insurance it's going to require, and we take a fairly rough average of the wear and tear, and we factor that into a daily charter, additional charter for the craft.
So you have something like an hourly rate for the machine? Is that?
Yeah, generally done as a day rate, but yeah, it could be split down into an hourly rate as well. Yes.
Is that the most significant part of the cost?
I think probably the most significant part of the cost, as long as they've got their own craft, it's just down to them to supply the fuel. Probably the most significant cost is the instructors, because our time, we're not just sat here as instructors, we've also got other jobs to do. So we've got to, it's almost like a business case to say my time's more valuable here doing instructing than it is off doing something else on that particular week or day.
Thanks.
Hopefully I should be able to share the video from the operation in Oita now. It looks like it's going to work. So we'll try that.
You do need to share with the sound. Yeah, I'm not hearing any sound.
Not essentially, it's only background music, this one.
Okay, all right.
There we go.
Very good, thank you.
So I was going to say one of the other people that's been involved with quite a lot of hovercraft training, particularly at Griffon, obviously, is John. So must be a few interesting experiences having done the same thing.
You want a comment?
That would be fantastic, John.
Yeah, it's been quite steady progress to get to that training package, hasn't it? Now it's very sort of very well documented and done now, and it's sort of it's arrived there, and there are. I mean, the good news is a lot of people coming back to pay for sort of further training, isn't it? I think that's been quite a recent success story to tell people that it's probably to their advantage to continue training as they get new people, and old people can forget things, dare I say.
It's definitely more noticeable that the operators that keep coming back for training, the craft tend to be better maintained. They tend to operate more efficiently. It's one of our longest serving, or one of our longest or most continuous customers for training is Auckland Airport. They've got a couple of 2000s out there. We go out there quite regularly, every 2 to 5 years, depending on the type of training required. And the craft are doing pretty well. The same in the Baltic states, in Finland, we're fairly regular out there. The craft are well maintained. In fact, they're probably the oldest 2000 TD still operating. You compare it to some other customers where they don't take on the training and it's handed down by word of mouth, and the operating technique becomes diluted, and it is definitely noticeable that the way the craft is operated tails off.
Could I ask, in relation to the Canadian Coast Guard, how does Griffon Hoverwork link with the Canadian Coast Guard? Are they completely training themselves by themselves?
For a very long time, I think the Canadian Coast Guard have been doing most of their own training. It's interesting, though, that only last year they have asked us to start looking at doing a training review. and I think we've noticed that with a couple of operators, which have generally been quite independent. Another one is the Indian Coast Guard. We've heard very, very little from them since the craft have been delivered. They're looking to have their new craft built in country under our license fairly shortly. But before they get built, they've actually asked for a training review of their own training program to see what we can bring to the table as well, which is really good.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions or comments?
I've got one. Do you find there's any problem with the unions, probably, between operators and maintenance crews, particularly as you're replacing a segment of a skirt? I found at Heathrow Airport, where they had Skimmer 4, that every time they lost a segment, it had to go into the maintenance bay and queue up with other things that had to be maintained, and they weren't allowed to do their own maintenance. This is Auckland Airport. They originally had a Skimmer 12, as well as the N6, and they wanted every fireman in the whole of their crew to be able to operate the hovercraft, instead of having a dedicated small team. I don't know what the situation is now.
It's interesting you say that. Generally speaking, if we explain the expectations of the course in advance, it's not normally too much of an issue. I have had pilot students refuse to get down and repair a skirt segment, and it's normally met by a threat to suspend the training until they get down and do it. We're not moving anywhere till you get down there and do it. Here's the tools. I'll come with you. They don't refuse for very long, but they do get a bit. Sometimes they get a bit grumpy. Generally speaking, I think particularly if you start the course focused on the systems and how the craft works, and the first day you're crawling around the plenum and you're saying this is how the skirt system works, and they can't really argue after that. They've been down there and seen it.
Okay, any thoughts from Brian? You were mentioning a moment ago that you have to train 12 people in an afternoon.
Well, that was, like 1996 or something. I'm building a craft for a fire department, and they announced that they're bringing the entire volunteer crew, and they want us to train everyone. And we suggested maybe they let us select a few people after a quick lap around the lake. And yeah, that was 20 plus years ago. But basically their program, they decided that they would do their own training, and unfortunately they chose to not listen to any advice, so they conducted all of their training in a field.
Goodness.
So not only was the craft absolutely packed full of grass everywhere, but it lasted a decade or so before it finally had to come to me for major repair work. They collided with their own trailer. So through the lift fan, through the guard, through the propeller, took out a rudder. So that took me quite a while to fix. But yeah, we always state very clearly that initial operations should never occur on land, as land is rarely flat and far less forgiving than water. But anyway, I have since, before we sell craft, get much more insistent with clients about what the training requirements are and so forth when they buy machines.
It's interesting as well that sometimes we have operators that spend most of their time operating a hovercraft on ice, or otherwise, or the other way around, they spend most of their time operating on water, and then it suddenly freezes, and there's suddenly a new set of challenges. And we have done it. I think in Estonia, we went out and we did some specific water training, because they only ever tended to use up to a certain time. They only ever used the hovercraft in the ice season, and then suddenly they needed to use it in the summer when the boats weren't available, and they couldn't get the craft over hump. They'd never had to do it. So, or it was so long since they'd had to do it.
Incredible.
Yeah, well, I would certainly consider ice to be a more challenging environment, and I tell people that's a more advanced thing. Like driving on land takes more practice, and we got to get there after we learn basic operations on the water. But another client, much more recently, had discovered in their ranks that they already had someone who had driven the vessel that I built before
Right.
for another company. And I sort of blurted out, well, that could be great or terrible. And because I knew the client, and they had bought 3 craft and refused all training. Their simple quip was, "We know boats."
Yes.
So anyway, that was interesting, because the person had operated it for a few hundred hours, but when we began the training, it was a little exciting. The craft was doing spins and other such things, and I had to quickly tell them that we needed to head back to the classroom for a minute.
Yes.
Not to mention the fact that my wife was sending text messages from the back seat telling me she wanted to get off.
That's never a good sign.
Yes. So, yeah. So, yeah, it's just oftentimes very interesting. I did have another training event where we had, they hired a specific captain. We trained, and then they had one of the relatives was a helicopter pilot, so he took control for a little bit and learned some things. And in the end, they weren't receptive to this sort of information, but it turned out the mechanic was the best driver. And the helicopter pilot tossed us all off our seats.
That doesn't surprise me. I've definitely had that with trainees before, where the most junior person in terms of rank in a certain organisation is by far the best hovercraft pilot, and the person with the most gold braid and all the stuff on their hat turns up, and you have to very discreetly provide a thanks for turning up certificate rather than a type rating at the end of the training, because they're just so awful. And it's very difficult to be able to, you have to go and have a very discreet conversation sometimes and say, maybe just sit in the other seat for the rest of the training, and we'll come up with something at the end of it, so you can save a bit of face. It's,
Yep. Chris, you were.
Then I was wondering, do you actually ask the students for input or for suggestions, or do you have a system for doing that? And has that worked for you?
Not so much if you've got somebody brand new. If it's somebody brand new, you say, well, this is the basics of driving the craft, and you stick to a set structure. When you get to people that have had quite a bit of experience, and you're coming back for maybe the 4th or 5th time over a set period of time, and they say, oh, we found the craft can do this, or we've got this technique. I learn as much as them sometimes. It is very useful, and we do feed that back. And when we're doing, so for example, Auckland Airport is one of the operators that we've set up as a Griffon approved training organisation, because they do all their own training. They've got their own instructors that we approve. We give them the syllabus, and we go back every 5 years now, and then have a couple of weeks out with them and just make sure that the training's still going as it should do. But it's those sorts of people that you can come back and say, this is the training report, and actually they've picked up on some good things. Hovercraft, there are certain things, there's more than one way to do it. There's some things that you should only do it one way, but there are more than one way to do certain other things, and it has been really useful. Have you found that yourself, Chris?
Sorry, what was that?
Have you found that yourself when you've been doing the training?
Absolutely. Everything that you've discussed in this subject, we experience exactly the same thing on the smaller craft. And because we have a great variety of students, we also have a lot more interesting situations occur. So I've always said in the hands of a novice, hovercraft are magnetically attracted to all obstacles. And everyone laughs at that, but that is usually the biggest problem that we find. The students crash the craft in the very first few hours. So the main job is to try and prevent that from happening. So you have to practice away from all obstacles. That's the main thing. And the other thing we point out is that the fan is 100 horsepower vacuum cleaner, so it's constantly sucking. So anything in the hovercraft has to be strapped down. You don't have the same situation with a fully enclosed machine, but that's one of the issues with the smaller craft. But all of these other things that Brian Phillips just mentioned about the expectations of students and fire departments and so on, it's all because of their complete ignorance that they do expect completely ridiculous things. Like we want everyone in the fire department to be able to go and do rescue sort of thing, or police department. And that's based on the fact that they have a lot of shifts and they want people in all of the shifts to be trained. And it's a phenomenal undertaking to train all of these people. And I've just come back from Australia, and I was amazed to find that a student learning to drive a car has to have 120 hours with a qualified driver, and has to be logged. That's just to drive a car. And yet with the hovercraft, since there's no regulations, everybody can sort of jump in and go. And this is, in a way, it's good that it's not regulated, but if it was regulated, that would be helpful, because it would stop the thinking that everyone could operate this. And they certainly can't. It's far more like a helicopter than it is a boat.
I think you picked up on some really important bits there. One of the big challenges we have, particularly when we're delivering training to customers overseas, is finding a suitable training location when we turn up, because we're not familiar with the area generally when we get there, and so you're having to find somewhere suitable quite quickly. I've been on the wrong end of having a poor training location more than once. It's certainly makes your days quite stressful. But yeah,
it can involve a lot of time, wasted time, actually, trying to figure out how a good training location, because it involves a lot of logistics where you have to move the people and the craft and all the equipment you need. And I much prefer to train at the factory than I do on location because of that reason. You can easily waste half a day driving around trying to find a suitable location. And even then you quite often don't succeed. So you have a lot of complicated issues that you've got to deal with when you're trying to train someone. There may be a pier there or a boat parked nearby, or houses, or there are all sorts of things come up, and you're dead right. It's surveying a suitable training location is that's number one in terms of avoiding accidents.
And again, the other thing which I think is really key that you picked up on is that there are there are very few people that have to stick to the regulations that we've talked about earlier in terms of high-speed craft code. There's so many exemptions for different organisations around the world, showing them the value of having a properly structured training program for each pilot. That can be challenging. Sometimes it sorts itself out and people sort of naturally see the benefit of doing it. Other times it can be quite a hard sell. It's yeah.
Can I just ask, when it comes to insuring these very, very expensive and incredible craft, how much attention is paid to the training that goes in, or aren't insurance companies particularly interested or educated enough to realise?
So that's a great question. Depends on the operator, I would guess. Have you come across this much, John, in the past?
That is a very good question, mainly because Griffon hasn't, when they sell the product to a Coast Guard or someone, it's totally the Coast Guard or the owner's responsibility to cover the insurance. So there hasn't, I mean, apart from something like a Hovertravel operation in the UK, which obviously we're very appreciative of their insurance, but so it hasn't been, it's not been a question that we've had. We've had things saying that the craft will be insured by the operator, the owner, throughout the training process, or words like that, but not actually having to get involved, and certainly don't know whether the insurance company says, are these people trained?
I guess the other thing is, of course, if they're government agencies, they're probably self-insured.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think most of the Griffon operations are either big companies or big organisations like airports or border guards, or or the RNLI, all those type of organisations which do have some. Yeah, I mean, how they insure things, we're not sure, but Finnish Coast Guard had a issue with a bit of driving and had at night in very bad conditions. It wasn't the fault, and had some damage, and we got told, asked to repair it, but we weren't ever. No insurance company ever turned up to look at what had been done. So presumably we said this is the price, and the border guard picked up the bill. So
I think interestingly, probably one of the cases where the insurance companies putting the pressure on a little bit onto the operator has been Oita, where they've turned around and said, right, next time you take a craft out, we need somebody that's been trained properly. And that did help to secure the training program.
Yeah, good selling point for Griffon.
Yeah.
It's interesting, actually, then, that taking up Tony's point that on insurance, that this issue of, if you like, commercial insurance actually relates more to the commercial operations. So the East Coast Canada 2000s, presumably they'll have commercial insurance of some kind, as well as Hovertravel having it. And I'm interested, I was going to ask Brian whether you know if SpaceX has external insurance for their craft, or whether they self-insure those. This is the two craft that are down in Texas.
I don't know. My suspicion is that they self-insure, and they have improved their training and so forth over time, but I think, like all clients, it was a evolution.
Okay.
At first, there was less of a focus, and now there's more of a focus. So it's taken time, but I think it Fortunately, organizations usually learn over time, and fortunately, in this case, they're learning without having too much pain to encourage the learning. So, I know other clients have certainly, you know, come to us for training, but only after they've had a problem.
The question of insurance is really a vast subject. And when I originally started business, everybody said that I wouldn't last very long because I would be sued out of existence, especially with the litigation in the US. Fortunately, that's never been the issue. So you're dealing with product liability, which you probably, Ben, don't have to worry about, but in the smaller market, product liability is a massive headache. And companies like SCAT, who produce 6,000 hovercraft, and we're a public corporation, were forced to have product liability. And it ran approximately $1,000 per craft to get that type of protection. This causes lots of issues with wealthy clients because they don't want to purchase a hovercraft if there's a risk that somebody could sue them. So they look for protection. There's a big subject to discuss all of that. Fortunately, individually, it limits the market tremendously because you can't, the banks and insurance companies are one and the same. So when you have an insurance company that won't insure it, then you can't get bank financing. So, and that limits the market to people who can self-finance. Fortunately, with the whole government agencies, the insurance, as you pointed out, Tony, they're self-insured. However, many of these fire departments have individual insurance companies, and they will cover certain accidents. And we're dealing with some of those situations at the moment. But it becomes quite a battle to prove that this is something that should be covered by insurance and not by warranty. They try to come back and get the craft repaired at our expense rather than having to go down the insurance route because that affects their deductible. And then the other issue with the insurance is if you well, actually, I've forgotten what point I was going to make there, but anyway, it's a vast subject, and it comes in so many aspects of operating hovercraft. We're not dealing with big hovercraft like you are, which would be a different subject, of course, than the smaller machines.
Thanks, Chris. James, you were going to comment?
Yeah, our survey hovercraft is actually insured and has been for quite a while with a marine P&I club, which is basically how ships are insured. And this is international; it's not based in the UK. They specialise in smaller, but I think their average vessel is about 1,000 tons, and they've got about 30,000 craft worldwide. So they tend to specialise in harbour type craft and tugs, specialist vessels. And I have to say that the P&I Club has been a joy to deal with. I mean, we've never made a claim, but compared to, say, your average car insurer, they are transparent. It's kind of like these P&I clubs are a club in that they are, I think, owned by the members. We get transparent information about their finances, about how they go about changing the premiums, what the claims have looked like for the last year and their reserves. And it's the only insurance that we hold that I actually feel is satisfactory and I'm not being ripped off by them. So that has actually been a pleasant aspect of this. I see Ben's nodding.
Yeah, what do you think, Ben?
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. It helps. It helps having people that understand that vessels operating in a marine environment don't come totally risk-free. And so if you've got somebody that understands that straight from the beginning, that's a good start. And the unique challenges of operating on the water, and I think if you go to a marine insurer, a hovercraft's probably not even at the most risky end of the scale of the stuff they're dealing with. If they're dealing with general things like tugboats and offshore structures, it's a good place to start.
Yes, the marine industry shipping is definitely a risky activity. I mean, up on the Humber where we're based, they don't really draw attention to the accident statistics, but I remember reading that at Immingham Dock, which is one of the busiest ports in the UK, I think they have an incident in about 1% of cases of ships going through the lock. So, knocks and bumps are pretty common.
It's just come back to me what point I wanted to make is when somebody's purchasing a hovercraft in the US and they need insurance, it's extremely difficult to get it. Nobody wants to be involved in that business. But there is one company that's sort of come out in the wash, and it's a company called Markel. And in recent times, Markel have begun to insist on training before they'll sell insurance. So that's a big help, because that's a way to drive customers towards the need for training. So I do see the insurance as a very important aspect of the training picture. So Tony, that's the way things are developing at the moment. You can get insurance. It's expensive, runs approximately $1,000 a year to insure a small hovercraft. And that's only for public risks. It's not going to be, it may be not insuring the structure. And perhaps Brian can comment on his experience, but this Markel company will insure craft, but they do require training.
Well, to my understanding, that's maybe one, I can't think of any others, companies in the US that will insure small hovercraft. However, we're largely excluded because every time a client tries to get insurance on the 24-foot craft, they won't insure it because they say it's enclosed.
Interesting.
Just end of discussion. I mean, I've had customers that have approached them more than once, been led along for a month of discussions, and then eventually it makes it to the underwriter and they say, oh, well, it's enclosed. You can't insure that.
Definitely has to be the first part of the discussion when you're trying to sell a hovercraft is, do you need insurance? Yeah. Because you can do exactly what you said. You can spend 2 months talking about a deal and then find that the whole thing just washes away when they can't get insurance.
Yeah.
I think this is definitely a subject which I'm going to have to do some research on. I did a bit of research a couple of months ago, somebody that asking a question about it. So I think I need to probably get in touch with a couple of you and take this a lot further to ease the process for hovercraft owners.
May I ask a question of Mr. Avery? So in very broad terms, can you tell us how you, I mean, I know Chris asked a bit, but can you give us some idea of what the costs are to the client of training? I mean, I've had customers refuse training even though I'm charging something that's just a tiny percentage of the vessel cost. You'd think with insurance being a question, there would be no, I could charge tens of thousands of dollars a day and it would still be worth it.
Yeah. I think I can give you a rough idea. If you were to do a week of training, a basic training program, it would work out somewhere between, depending on the craft size, between £5,000 and £10,000 per week per student.
Thank you.
Okay.
Which again, I think if you were comparing that to doing like a private pilot's license or helicopter training, I think or to quite a lot of different training courses, I think it's still pretty good value for money.
That's great.
I think you ought to point out, Ben, that you don't get all of it.
No, I don't get paid anything. So I do it
Just
for the
the old
fun.
defence, you know.
You just have the
echo
excitement.
Chris's point,
Sorry.
I just find it really interesting how little training people think they need, but somehow to get a driver's license in the United States, you have to train for a year. But so, somehow hovercraft training is supposed to be 1% of what it is to learn to drive a car.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I mean, I will point out that sort of rough figure. I mean, that would include things like our travel costs and accommodation and things like that as well. And again, the price will vary a little bit depending on if we're using a client's craft or they're using our craft in the UK. But that's generally about the right figure, I'd say.
I usually try to point out that the three-legged stool concept, where the hovercraft's one leg and costs a certain amount, there's the pilot training and the protocol of operation, which is the second leg, which costs about the same as the hovercraft. And the third leg is the maintenance. And that also costs about the same price as the hovercraft. If you put the whole thing together and compare it with a helicopter operation or learning to fly, the cost of learning to fly or learn to fly a helicopter is approximately the same cost as the buying the hovercraft. So it's a three-legged stool thing. That's the way I see it. And unfortunately, when people buy the hovercraft, they're just buying the one leg of a three-legged stool. And then they'll realize later that these other things have to be taken care of. Maintenance, very high maintenance costs. And it's very hard to find out what hovercraft costs to operate. There's no published information. So I spent a lot of time documenting that, and I can tell you that it costs us to run a small hovercraft very close to $1,000 an hour. Most of it's maintenance. A lot of the maintenance is cleaning, washing. You can run a hovercraft for 5 minutes and it can take an hour to clean it.
That's definitely part of the daily training as well. At the end of the day, if you've made all the mess on it, you can go and clean it off.
Yeah, especially in salt water.
Yeah,
very, very big cost there.
Okay, I think I ought to begin to draw us to a conclusion here, and maintenance is probably another subject to discuss. But I think you're right, Chris, in particular. That hovercraft is like an off-road machine, only to the extreme, where you're obviously you're operating in a place where you're going to get everything thrown at you, and it's not going to stay clean. Anyway, so may I thank you all very much for attending today. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and Ben, many thanks for your presentation, also the preparation that you made to be able to show it. So very much appreciated, and I hope that the recording will be watched by probably a lot more people. Should be very interesting to watch. It'll be up in a day or so.
You're very welcome. And nice to see you all again as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, Ben.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Yeah.